Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Well, today we reach gate 40 of the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. So you'll recall this is a text that we've been talking about on Sundays, and this particular piece was included in the 12 fascicle version of the Shobogenzo. So somehow this piece was taken from a larger text and incorporated there, and Dogen had a few things to say at the end of this thing. So this is not a text that Dogen himself wrote. But it says to me if it got included somehow, it was important to him. So that's good enough for me. And we've been going through one gate a week and uncovering what these gates point us toward from the point of view of our particular Dharma family. So today we have gate 40, not being foolish, is a gate of Dharma illumination, for it stops the killing of living beings. It turns out this is a really interesting gate. There is a lot going on here. So, frequently for foolishness in a text like this, we can read ignorance. And ignorance is maybe a more familiar term for us. Last week, I shared a verse at the end of a sutra in which the Buddha said one should associate with the wise and not with the foolish. So in that case, he was talking about monks who were sort of displaying their ignorance publicly, if you will, by quarreling. They were quarreling over the Dharma. It went on and on and on. So clearly they were displaying their ignorance of the things that Buddha had been teaching them, and he's calling them foolish. So that's one frame for thinking about this gate. But we also know that foolishness is one of the things that Uchiyama Roshi sees in modern life. So there's foolishness. The other thing is craziness. So we see this pairing. Uchiyama Roshi describes craziness and foolishness as two ends of a spectrum. The way that thinking and sleeping are perhaps two ends of the spectrum when it comes to Zazen. I'm sorry about my background. I don't know what's happening there. Clearly I'm not actually at Sunshin, so my cover is blown. Okay, so today I'm going to intentionally take the foolishness in this gate from Uchiyama Roshi's point of view, and then kind of tie all of these things together. So, two ends of the spectrum, right? We have craziness and foolishness. We have thinking and sleeping. This is the pattern that we're going to see today as we talk about these things. One pattern we're going to see. So, on the one hand, we've got craziness, chasing, overactivity, overthinking. On the other hand, we've got foolishness, ignorance, escaping or escapism, isolation, disengagement. So these are the two halves, maybe, of this pattern that we're going to see today. So, as I say, these play out in Zazen, but they also play out in just our day-to-day regular life. So let's start with foolishness as ignorance, and how that's related to working with this first precept about not killing, because the gate is bringing these two things together. So let's do that. Then let's look at foolishness as disengagement or inaction, and see how that might relate to the first precept. So we have several things to kind of draw together today. So ignorance here, as I say, is ignorance of Buddha's teachings, not knowing about the nature of suffering, not knowing about how suffering arises, not knowing about the three marks of existence, interconnection and impermanence and no self. So in general, being unaware of the kinds of things that Buddha was teaching. So if we don't understand how the universe really works, if we're out of touch, we might say, with this one unified reality, then we make mistakes, right? The basis for action is incomplete or unclear. So to avoid making mistakes about killing beings, we have to be really clear about who and what those other beings are, and we have to be really clear about who and what this self is, right? And I think we need to understand how those things are related. And then we avoid making the kind of mistakes that this gate is pointing us away from. So, of course, one of the first problems we run into with the first precept is that it's really not possible to live without eating other beings. If we do no other killing, we have to eat something in order to keep this body alive as the basis of our practice, as the ground of our practice. So right away, very first precept, the very first thing we run into is this is not possible for us in this human form. So even if we are scrupulous about paying attention to precepts, maintaining precepts, even if we understand deeply everything that Buddha taught, Ignorant or not, we're going to kill beings because we're living on this planet in this human form. So the question is, what is our attitude toward that? What's our thinking around that? Are we running around killing beings because we enjoy killing beings? Has anger turned into aggression? We've talked about anger and aggression here. Has anger turned into aggression? Are we acting that out in some unskillful way? Do we feel powerful because we've killed something? Do we feel strong and validated because we've killed something? Are we feeding our ego with this kind of killing? Or maybe we're just sort of killing indiscriminately. We are harvesting more food than we need, and that's not all getting used. Or we're cutting down more trees than we need, and something's not happening, with the wood. Are we acting in a way that encourages other people to be unskillful and kill beings, right? So there's all of these ways that we can participate in this unwholesome dynamic. And I think we also have to think about what is our approach to taking care of ourselves and the health of this body, because even if we're practicing not being attached to the body, even if we are not attached to the sense data that come in from this body, and some, there's early practices around that, still we have to give the body some care, right? We still have to give this body the care it needs as the ground of our practice. So we have to be careful about, not damaging this or not killing this as well. So there's so many aspects to this thing. Being uncompassionate to the body is not part of our practice, right? The kind of asceticism that does permanent damage to this body is not what the Buddha taught. We know, he discovered that starving himself was not the path to awakening, right? He gave that up. He said, moderation, or the middle way, is a better path. So all those motivations, all those attitudes are the result of ignorance. That means forgetting about how suffering arises, forgetting that whole cycle about suffering arising from craving and aversion, and how we're feeding the three poisons with all that stuff. We forget that all beings are interconnected. So, pouring unwholesomeness into that network affects everybody. It's not just us or even the immediate, people that are immediately around us. If we're pouring unwholesomeness into that network, we're creating some poison for the whole network. We might forget that everything is empty, everything is impermanent. So, killing beings doesn't really solve anything, right? It doesn't fix anything for the small self in the long term. But all of that is happening in the relative world of form. So we also know that in the absolute view, there are no beings. There is no life and death. It's impossible to kill anything. So this is the view from complete non-separation and complete non-discrimination. And our practice is to hold both of these viewpoints at the same time. So that's our challenge, right? We can't live only in the world of form, and we also can't live only in the world of the absolute. So, how do we carry both of these things and see in both of these ways? So Hojo-san has taught about this. He says, there is being free from discrimination or judgment. There is also valuing and protecting life. How can we do both at the same time within one action? This is a really difficult koan. We're confused, and to experience being confused is an important part of our practice. It means that we are free from fixed ideas about life, death, taking life, this precept, and our practice. However, being confused and free from fixed ideas can also lead us to negate life. So in the midst of that confusion, we still have to be careful. We still have to pay attention. So this is what Uchiyama Roshi is saying too, but he's saying it in a kind of different way. So let's look for a moment at what he says about this whole craziness, foolishness thing, and then come back to see how that is related to or ties up with what Hojo-san says. These two things are related. So Uchiyama Roshi says on one hand, we have this craziness and thinking, which are both active. And if we're spending our zazen time thinking, then we're grabbing at stuff, we're pushing away stuff, we're writing stories about what's going on in our heads. There's a lot of activity and a lot of energy around that. We're not sitting quietly. If we're spending, so that's, the zazen piece. If we're spending the rest of our lives on craziness, then we're sort of madly chasing around after progress, after trying to get ahead, being pulled around by the demands of the small self, right? So our karmic stuff is pulling us around. And we're chasing and running away, right? So we're moving all the time. On the other hand, we have sleeping and foolishness. That's the other half of this thing, which are both inactive. So if we're spending our zazen time sleeping, then we've just become inert. You know, we're not really paying attention to what's going on in the body and mind. We don't really care about what we're doing. The posture kind of slumps, right? We're kind of checked out. If we're spending the rest of our lives off the zazen cushion on foolishness, then we're trying to preserve some sense of peace and calm because we think that's the way things are supposed to be. And we're doing that by not engaging with anything, even when there's work to be done, even when somebody needs our help. Somehow we're disengaged. We've kind of gone to sleep, right? So the craziness and foolishness pairing comes up when Uchiyama Roshi is teaching about the meaning of zazen in modern life. He says we're so caught up in achievement and competition that we're always busy, we're always working hard. He called modern civilization crazy civilization. On the other hand, he says Buddha's teaching is to settle down within the self. So not chasing after things outside based on desire, based on our karmic conditioning. So an important early Buddhist practice or a Buddhist teaching was to try to break the enchantment of the senses, if you will. You know, we get enchanted by the things that come in through the senses. We get caught up in those things. They're kind of seductive, right? We want things to feel good. So this early practice was to be less distracted, if you will, by the physical sensations. So these things that are coming in through the body, the stories that we write about those sensations are compulsion, right, to chase after and to run away from. So, of course, we prefer pleasant sensations to unpleasant sensations. This is the human condition. This is true of humans and animals and plants and everything, right? If we're alive, we don't like unpleasant sensation. We like the pleasant ones. So that means we can be distracted by what we're feeling in this body. We chase after the feelings we like, we run away from the feelings we don't like, we get agitated by our engagement with the world. It makes sense then, doesn't it, to try to protect ourselves or protect our peace of mind by deciding to just ignore this world of form. I'm not going to engage with any of this stuff because it breaks my peace of mind. It makes me, it stirs me up, so I'm going to ignore it. In modern terms, we call that spiritual bypassing. You may have run into that term somewhere in your practice or somewhere in your reading. So I'm only going to pay attention to the world from the absolute point of view, where everything's okay, right? There is no discrimination, there is no separation, everything's okay, whatever I do doesn't matter because in the big world, everything's fine. So in the absolute world then, there's no killing, there are no beings that are doing the killing, there are no beings being killed. But of course, that's only half the story, right? It's not the reality of the universe in its entirety. So those are important teachings, but we can't live only there. So what the early Buddhists were trying to do was to become less attached to the senses so they could settle down, so they could see clearly, so that they could understand, take in what the Buddha was teaching, and have some experience of awakening, right? So that was the intent, but we can see that we can take that kind of practice and use it simply to make ourselves feel better, right? By avoiding suffering, avoiding our suffering, or what is coming in, because of our suffering. But this idea of settling down within the self and not being pulled around by desire can create this kind of foolish civilization that Uchiyama is talking about if we are not careful with that, if we misinterpret it. It results in isolationism. It results in escapism, right? We're cutting off connection with external objects. We're stopping thinking so that the mind can become peaceful. Somehow we're going to stop this thinking so that we can settle down. So Uchiyama Roshi sees these two things as a pair. Becoming so fixated on getting something that we don't see anything else, this crazy kind of chasing, versus the escapism of thinking, well, everything's okay, we don't need to make any effort, we don't need to take anybody else into account, in the big world everything's fine. So both of these seem pretty self-centered, don't they? Because they're all based on, I need something, I want something. So Uchiyama Roshi is trying to find the middle way between peace and progress. And this is his big question that we hear about all the time, right? Is there a way to do both of these things and do them in a wholesome way? Can we have peace, but can we also have progress? In other words, how do we balance the foolishness with the craziness? So he's not saying that there isn't some good in both of those kinds of motivations, because craziness is associated with movement, right? It's associated with change, making things better. Foolishness can be associated with tranquility and with peace of mind. So all of those things seem like good, positive things, and they are. His question is it possible to integrate those two things into a wholesome life, right? Into a wholesome world? And of course, his answer is yes. It is possible to do both of those things in a wholesome way. And it happens in two places, or in two ways. One is in Zazen. Our practice is not about stopping our thinking. We know that's not possible. If we're alive and the brain is functioning, it's not possible to stop our thinking. What we stop is the interacting with the thoughts. It's the grabbing the thoughts, it's the pushing the thoughts away, it's the writing the story about the thoughts, which means we're not separate. We don't create separation from the thoughts. So it's not the thinking itself that we're going to stop. It's what we're encouraging is the non-thinking, right? It's the going beyond the thinking. It's not grabbing the thinking, not driving the thinking. So we settle because we're not grasping thoughts, because we're not acting on those thoughts, not because we're going to somehow suppress our thinking, which is like not possible. So the other place that this plays out is in our regular bodhisattva life. We work diligently, we work wholeheartedly, we make a lot of effort, but we do it for beings. We do it for all beings rather than for ourselves. So we settle because we're not feeding the three poisons. We're not creating suffering based on that. So we're still active, we're still engaged, but we're not doing it based on small, selfish kind of stuff, right? And so in that way we settle. So in Zazen and in life, we get to settle down. We get to do that thing. We don't do it by stopping everything. Kind of not possible. So Hojo-san says about this, neither being a slave to desire nor being lifeless is samadhi. Or we could say neither craziness nor foolishness, is samadhi. Neither one is the answer. There's a middle way here. So he goes on to say, the place where we can settle the whole self on the self is the here and now, and we do that by being attentive to what we're doing. If the mind is somewhere else during activity, we're creating separation from that activity and samadhi is lost. The Mahayana approach to concentration is not to stop thinking, but to include thinking in becoming one with the entire world. So, understanding interconnection is the key here. This is how we live according to the first precept and keep from foolishly killing beings, which is what this gate is warning us about. So Hojo-san goes on to say, the main point of this precept of not killing is that we are living as part of the network of interdependent origination in time and space. How we can keep the network in as healthy a condition and continue to live with Buddha's wisdom. To do so, we need to embrace and have compassion for all beings, not for our personal benefit or the benefit of a particular group of people. I belong to Japanese society, and you may belong to a Western society, or to a family, or a company, or to other groups, including a Buddhist Sangha. If we think we are doing things for ourselves as individuals, or for certain groups, separate from other parts of the network, we are killing life. Now, isn't that interesting? That's not a take we usually have on this first precept. So let's pull some of these things together. Buddha says, first precept is about don't kill things, don't kill beings, right? Uchiyama Roshi says, trying to keep happy and calm by disengaging from others, by ignoring interconnection, means we don't live as bodhisattvas and we don't carry out our bodhisattva vows. So that's a problem. Hojo-san says, ignoring interconnection and keeping our wisdom and compassion to ourselves is killing life. So we've got three teachers kind of saying the same thing, right? Not being foolish is a gate of Dharma illumination, for it stops the killing of living beings. So the way to avoid killing beings is not by ignoring or escaping or disengaging from them. It's exactly the opposite. We've got to stay in touch with beings if we're going to avoid killing beings. So if we're foolish in the sense of not bothering to get involved with the lives and the suffering of other beings, we're not nurturing life. And if we're foolish in the sense of being ignorant of interconnection, then we're killing beings. So isn't that interesting? No matter what we think about interconnection, of course, it's already there. This is not something we have to go out and create. That interconnection is already there. We might not choose to see it. We're connected whether we like it or not, or whether we're interested in that or not. So it doesn't really matter, frankly, whether we want to be involved. We're already involved, right? That connection is already there. Chances are we're disturbing our own peace more in the long run by ignoring the reality of interconnection than by recognizing what's actually going on. So I might not want to have any relationship with my neighbors, but wishing won't make it so, right? The fact is we're already connected. I'm already connected with my neighbors. I can spend my time and energy running away from that, or I can spend my time and energy making that relationship work. So which of those things seems to be more wholesome? Maybe you've heard of the experiment that was done in the 1940s in an orphanage. There was one group of newborns that was cared for normally, and there was another group that had its basic kind of needs met, but it got no other attention. So these babies were fed, they were kept clean, they had the basics of life, but the caregivers were told not to touch these babies more than necessary, not to look at them more than necessary. So they were not communicating extensively with these babies. There was no extended interaction. They just filled the basic needs, kind of kept them sanitary. That was all. This experiment had to be stopped after just 4 months because most of those babies died. Even those who survived had lifelong issues after this experiment. So I first heard about this experiment sometime in high school, I think. And it came back to me immediately when I read Hojo-san saying that ignoring that interconnection was killing life. I immediately thought of that story. It's pretty powerful, right? I mean, it says, it's a pretty concrete example. If we ignore that interconnection, boy, there's some powerful consequence to that. In this case, life was taken. So now when we say interconnection, of course, that includes several other important teachings, because we know interconnection is not kind of a thing by itself. One is dependent origination, or the teaching that nothing arises from nothing, right? There are causes and conditions for everything. So when those causes and conditions change, then of course what arises changes. So that's where we also have teachings about impermanence. So these things are related. When we put dependent origination together with impermanence, then of course we get emptiness, right? Emptiness means that conditioned things are empty of any kind of fixed or permanent self-nature. So there's nothing we can grab onto and say, this is the essence of this thing forever and ever. Everything is changing. And because everything is connected, there's no boundary around anything in the big world. We can't really say this is where one dharma stops and the next dharma starts. Everything is interconnected. So we have emptiness. So nothing arises on its own. So it's not separate from anything else. Causes and conditions changing all the time, right? So all of these things are tied together. So not being foolish is not losing sight of interconnection. That also means it's not losing sight of interdependence or emptiness. So we kind of get the whole thing together. We can't really ignore any one piece of this thing. Foolishness means, there's something we're not seeing, and if we're not seeing one thing, we're probably not seeing the other ones either. So having peace of mind doesn't require that we escape from the world or that we somehow make everything stop. That would kind of be a foolish interpretation, right? When we're foolish in that way, we deny the reality of the life of beings. In other words, we kill beings, right? So there's something really interesting about that whole connection. We have peace of mind when we see how things really are, on the other hand, right? And we stop living based on the 3 poisons. So not being foolish doesn't mean we secede somehow from Indra's net, which wouldn't be possible anyway. In fact, we throw ourselves completely into Indra's net because we're actually already completely there with all beings. We can't separate ourselves from the net, so just throw yourself in there because the reality is you're already there. Peace of mind comes from living in harmony with all those beings that are already with us in Indra's net, rather than killing them, whether that's intentional or not. All of these things are things we can chew on, right? Like, how do we completely throw ourselves into Indra's net, despite the fact that we're already there? And how is that about nurturing life and about not killing beings? So there's some noodling we can do on all of those connections. So today I am giving the last word, if you will, to Kodo Sawaki, who is my Dharma great-grandfather, because he had a lot to say about human foolishness. The word, of course, that he used was stupidity. He didn't pull his punches. Kodo Sawaki had plenty to say about this. One of his more famous phrases was grupu boku, or group stupidity. So if you do any reading Kodo Sawaki, you're going to run into what he says about group stupidity. So a point he makes repeatedly is that we can get caught up in doing or thinking whatever our group is doing or thinking, whatever that group is that we're in the middle of at the moment. When we do that, we stop thinking for ourselves, right? We kind of disengage and we stop thinking for ourselves. So that group could be the company we work for, it could be our family, our peer group, our political party, our sangha, our country, whatever. We can get caught up in just going along. And if we're doing that, we're kind of disengaging. So Sawaki Roshi's well-known writing about this is, when people are alone, they're not so bad. However, when a group forms, paralysis occurs. People become totally foolish and cannot distinguish good from bad. Their minds are numbed by the group. Others work on advertising to attract people and intoxicate them for some political, spiritual, or commercial purpose. I keep some distance from society, not to escape it, but to avoid this kind of paralysis. To practice Zazen is to become free of this group's stupidity. So it's important that he says he does keep some distance from society, and we would think, well, that's just the opposite of what we've been talking about here. But he's not doing this to keep himself comfortable. He's not disengaging from society in order to sort of, keep his peace of mind and keep from being agitated and all of that. He's doing it to limit his distractions so that he can see this one unified reality and then work for all beings, right? So he's doing it in order to see clearly and escape from, if you will, the group stupidity. So for him, one of the things that happens when we sit is that the mind stays sharp and we can drop our self-involvement and we can get some clarity, right? So the wisdom and the compassion arise naturally because we've got some clarity. So we can see ourselves clearly and our own motivations and our own delusions and kind of what's going on here. We also get to see the world clearly. Then we can go out and do what needs to be done. We can go out and live this bodhisattva life that balances the craziness and the foolishness. So sitting is not a means of retreating into our own little comfortable world where, nothing can bother us and nothing can disturb us, and we're sitting because we want to have some kind of bliss or because we want to, kind of remove our stress or something like that. It's not about creating our own little comfy world, right? It's about getting the clarity we need so we can go out and engage and do the bodhisattva work that needs to be done. So it's interesting here that he uses the word intoxicate, because I think we can associate that with some foolishness, right? Advertisers attract and intoxicate people for their own purpose, according to him. So it takes us right back to Bono, right? This seductive desire that we've talked about here before. When we talked about Gate 36, being without hindrances, we talked about Bono. And, I said that the kanji for Bono have this feeling of seduction, enchantment, right? It's like we can't help ourselves. We are seduced by the things that the small self wants, right? We just sort of can't keep from making a mistake. So of course there's also this whole precept about intoxicants. And in the Kyoju Kaimon it says, do not bring intoxicants in, do not let them come in. This is truly the great brightness of wisdom. So every time we do rakusatsu, we hear this. When we take precepts, we hear this. Do not bring the intoxicants in, but don't let them come in either. So don't actively go out and get them, but don't let them kind of just show up, right? This is truly the great brightness of wisdom. So intoxication is about clouding our vision, right? We kind of let go of our wisdom. It's there, but we can't get to it because we're intoxicated by whatever it is we're intoxicated by, which is a kind of a form of foolishness. If we're not seeing clearly, we're ignoring emptiness and interconnection and interdependence and all the things that Buddha taught, right? So whatever we're using as an intoxicant, and of course that could be anything. It could be alcohol and drugs, but it could be chocolate or shopping or anything that we use as a distraction to make ourselves feel better. Whatever that intoxicant is moving us away from reality or away from seeing reality. Reality doesn't go anywhere. It's moving us away from seeing reality. It's moving us off into our own kind of little world, right? Instead of supporting our practice of seeing the universe clearly and seeing the true nature of all beings and being able to take some wholesome action about that. So in order to see clearly and to understand, we have to do some discernment. That means asking questions, right? It means maintaining a spirit of inquiry, whether that's during our zazen or just in our day-to-day, moment-by-moment life. We're constantly kind of always doing discernment. What's going on? What's happening here? That doesn't mean we're psychoanalyzing ourselves all the time, but it means we're engaging It means we're open to what's going on, in the universe. What's the universe telling me? What's the Dharma here? How do I practice with this? There's just this constant openness, right? We're not closing ourselves off. There's this constant openness. What's coming in? What am I doing with that? So you can't do discernment in isolation, right? If you cut yourself off from things, from the universe, or even from yourself, you can't do discernment. We need to be paying attention to ourselves and our experiences and what's happening in the world. So, for instance, if we're going to understand anger, we have to fully enter into that, right? We talked about anger a week or two ago. If we're going to understand anger, we can't cut ourselves off from that. We have to completely enter into it. It's the same for grief or embarrassment or disappointment or any other kind of uncomfortable condition that happens here. We can't cut ourselves off from that, because if we do, we can't do the discernment that we need to do. So no one can do that discernment for us. We have to explore these things for ourselves. We can read all the teachings we want to about these conditions. We can talk to people about it. That can be really helpful. But in the end, we have to do our own work, right? We have to do our own discernment. So that means we're willing to feel the discomfort. It means we're willing to accept that there is suffering for ourselves and for all beings. So if job one for the Bodhisattva is to show up and not look away, which you've heard me say many times, job one is we show up, we don't look away. We accept that there is suffering. It's going on here, and it's going on in the world. Then that's the opposite of foolishness, it seems to me, right? We may not understand what we're seeing. We may not know what to do about it. That's completely okay. As Hojo-san says, being confused is part of our practice. At least if we're confused, we have a spirit of inquiry. We haven't sort of come to a conclusion and cut off the world or cut off our inquiry, right? So having that openness and being confused is part of the practice. That's part of discernment. So that's okay. That's why we've got teachers. That's why we have sanghas. That's why we all come together. How many times in a week, right? It's to help each other do that work, do that discernment. So Sawaki Roshi says our practice of Zazen is looking at the world afresh after being in hibernation. I think it's a really interesting sort of mental picture, right? We wake up and come out of the cave of our own delusion and our own confusion, right? And we look around. And, it's like, oh, now I get it. There are beings out there. We're all living the same life within this total dynamic functioning of the universe. I need to take care of them. I need to not cut off their lives. I need to not kill life. So all beings, by the way, of course, means all beings. All of them. We don't get to pick and choose which ones we're connected to. We don't get to pick and choose, who gets our compassion, who deserves our compassion. We're already connected to all of them. They already are the recipients of our wisdom and compassion. They're all included in our practice, whether we personally like them, get along with them, agree with them, or not. We're talking all beings here, right? So when this gate says not being foolish means we don't kill beings, it means we don't kill any beings. So if someone asks for the Dharma, we don't begrudge the Dharma. If we don't make any, we don't make any distinction between the people who deserve to be free from suffering and the people who don't deserve to be free from suffering. Because where is the boundary? How are those people not me? So, if we can't take that approach, then we're being foolish in all the meanings of foolishness that we've looked at today. So, we take responsibility for looking broadly and looking deeply and asking, what effect am I and my thoughts and speech and actions through places we create karma? What effect are all of those things having on other beings around me and on the universe as a whole? What am I putting into Indra's net? And it starts with what we think, and it goes to what we say, and then it goes to the action we take. So we need to be doing some discernment pretty early on in that process so that we're not pouring unwholesomeness somehow into that net through our foolishness. So what kinds of subtle delusion am I not seeing? We know there's the gross delusion. We can see that, but the farther we dig down, the more we do Zazen, the more we open the hand, the more we settle, the more we become intimate with ourselves and our foolishness. What kinds of subtle foolishness am I not seeing? Because there's probably something there, right? This practice has no end. We never come to the end of vows. We never come to the end of delusion. There's always the next layer of foolishness. How can I see that? What am I taking for granted as true that might not be, that might only be my assumption. It might not actually be true because it's a story I'm telling myself. And it's something I maybe came to believe in my childhood. Is it really true? Is it really the nature of the universe, or is it what I'm thinking, or what I'd like to think, or what I'm comfortable with, right? This subtle kind of foolishness, boy, it's way down in there. So, the more we can uncover those things compassionately, this is not about beating ourselves up for things, compassionately. How do we look at our foolishness? How do we practice with our foolishness? How do we when we uncover a new area of foolishness, it's like, what do we do with that, right? So our practice is not to avoid looking at that, and we'd sure like to because it's uncomfortable. It's not something we enjoy. So when we uncover those delusions, when you find one and you crack it open, something really important happens. It's like something really shifts for you in the way you see the world and in the way you see yourself. And it's a really interesting moment. It's like, oh, wait a minute. There's this whole thing I never saw, or there's this whole thing I never understood, or wow, I've been doing this pattern. I've got this habituated thinking. I've been doing this like for a long time. Why? It's not serving anybody. When you have those moments, it's scary because like your worldview kind of shifts, but at the same time, there's something really liberating. Whew, I don't have to do that thing. I don't have to get stuck with that thing. It's like I can let go of that thing and see what's really happening and really do the bodhisattva thing in this moment. It's like, whew, it's like some change just like lets go. It's really, really interesting. But it takes some courage, doesn't it, to look at our foolishness and to look at the effects of our foolishness, which are kind of scary. I mean, this gate says if we're foolish, we're killing beings. Like, that's a big deal, right? We're not taking a knife to beings maybe, but there's something we're doing to not nurture life and to hinder the way the universe is flowing. So if we could live in a way that lessened that or didn't do that, isn't that what bodhisattva life is, right? So whenever we see these delusions, even these little ones, let's crack them open. Let's look at what's happening. Something really important happens there. We see the world differently when that happens. We stop being foolish. In that moment, we get to save beings, right? What would you like to say about all those connections, all those kind of interesting interconnections about foolishness, what foolishness is, how it arises, and how that affects killing life or nurturing life? What would you like to say? And make sure you unmute so we can hear you if you have something to say. No comments this morning?
Yeah, there's some comments.
Okay, please.
I think this is so huge, so all-encompassing. It's really hard to talk about, but I was sitting here and I was thinking about in the early days of San Shen and where we were, and we had resident priests, and we were going through a really difficult time. And there came about this question of authenticity. And you kind of skimmed over that pretty quickly about how what you think is what you say is what you do. And that really brought me back around to what's authentic practice, what's an authentic person, and it's, within this practice, just being available to the practice means that you're dropping off the confusion that's causing whatever foolishness you're doing at any particular time. So that comes around to the foolishness of self-concern turned into the concern for others. So there's that wisdom that can flow out of that kind of interaction and that kind of practice. So that's just some of the places I went with this.
Well, as you say, there are so many places to go with this. You read this gate, at first you just go, okay, what's happening? And then when you really dig into it, it's pretty interesting. So authenticity, that's an interesting word. isn't it? Of course, our practice, one of the outgrowths of our practice, I think, is that we are better able to be our true selves. And that's not a self that we have some ideas about. I should be like this, I should be like that. Um, on the one hand, in the big world, it's, we are better able to manifest Buddha nature in a clear way, in a way that's not clouded by stuff, by foolishness, right? But I think even just in the small self personality, I think we do get to be more authentic, perhaps, as we practice, because we get to see what actually motivates me, what actually drives my thinking and my speech and my actions, and are these the things, is that um, is that clouded by something? What do I actually believe to be true, and why do I think it's true, right? That's one of the elements of spiritual health, is knowing what do I believe and why do I believe that? And I think if we start to look at foolishness and the areas in which we are foolish, we get to see, why do I think that? Why do I believe that? Where did that come from? Is it actually a reflection of my true nature and the one unified reality, or is it something which is clouding me, right? Authenticity is not about we all need to be the same kind of practitioner. We know, just looking at the conversations between Kodo Sawaki and Uchiyama Roshi, here's a teacher and a student, and Uchiyama Roshi is saying, if I practice forever and ever, will I get to be like you? Because we know Kodo Sawaki had a sharp tongue and a loud voice, very dynamic, and Uchiyama Roshi is a very quiet, kind of reserved guy, and he's saying, if I practice, do I get to be like you? And Uchiyama Roshi says, no, you get to be like you, right? Uchiyama Roshi writes in Opening the Hand of Thought, a violet needs to be a violet and a rose needs to be a rose, and both of those things are valuable, right? They're both authentically what they are. So I think if we start to look at our foolishness, we see where we get pulled away from authenticity, which is really kind of interesting. I also think our practice gives us some courage, because one of the things that we let go of, I think, is some of our fear. Because the fear is driven by our self-concept. I don't want my self-concept to be threatened, whatever I think that is, right? When we see what the self really is, we get to start dropping fear. I think that makes us more courageous. I think it makes us better able to sort of go out in the world and do what needs to be done. But I think there's an interesting effect on our relationships too, right? If we're able to be more authentic and more courageous in our relationships, are we not going to have more healthy relationships and not kill beings and not cut off life, right? Because I'm not worried about I have to protect this, whether that's my peace of mind or my self-concept, or, I'm afraid you're going to injure me, or you're going to see how inadequate I am, or just, all the things that go with small self. I think we get to be more authentic in that way as well, right? So I can't set that up as a goal of practice, because we know Zazen is good for nothing. Our practice doesn't have a goal. But I think one of the outcomes, maybe, one of the things that happens when we practice and we really get familiar with ourselves and intimate with ourselves and our own foolishness, is we get to be more authentic, which is really kind of interesting. So, Hoshin, do you want to follow up on any of that? Anything else you want to say about that?
Not yet, no.
Okay. All right. You're raising interesting stuff, though. I hope other people will jump on board. Other things people would like to say? I think Iris is unmuting.
Sorry, I couldn't find my cursor.
I understand.
So, when the last couple of minutes that you were speaking in the talk, I have to say, felt like, to me, in my personal listening to what you're saying, I had clarity for myself about what you were talking about to me. Was about learning about art in our society, culture of white supremacy, and my personal journey through that, learning about myself and how I am a part of it, and how I see it everywhere. How I'm starting to see it. I, like many people, have gone through a recent journey of discovering some things that have already been happening. As you said, the reality that's already been there. I'm, I'm showing up to the party now. And yeah, and just somehow in what you were talking about made me think about, I'm sorry, I might be a little all over the place here, but when I tend to think about, Indra's net and there's nothing outside, um, and sometimes I have to actually like think about that. It's very interesting to have to think about anyway. Um, and with what I've been going through, just my understandings recently, um, and realizing about our culture of white supremacy is that like I've been thinking that I understand the everything, except that, no, it's that I'm, white supremacy is like, here is our box of everything, and here's Indra's net of everything, even though it's excluding so much. And so many, lots of voices and perspectives. And in my own experience, I think that for many, many years, being part of, an ethnic group, I guess that that when I think of white supremacy, it's like, oh, my ethnic group is an ethnic group that they hate. So, why would I be a part of that? And so, of course, learning about it has been really eye-opening to see what I actually am a part of. And what you're talking about the not being part of interconnectedness as killing, I can clearly see in my own life on a, and you're talking about a very subtle level. I was just having a conversation with Nate yesterday about a very dear and important friend of mine. She's a person of color, and we talk about a lot of stuff together. She's one of my favorite people in Lafayette, and recently I've been kind of just noticing a very, very, very subtle reaction that I have when she starts talking about her own experiences that 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 I don't, as a white person, I don't understand at all, and how just on an extremely subtle level, I feel like I'm not being like, yeah, I don't believe you. That's not what I'm experiencing, but it's like the tiniest little subtle question mark. And I'm like, whoa, that's my, participation in white supremacy. Holy moly. And that's on a very subtle level. That is like kind of killing, I mean, feels weird when I say it. So anyway, thank you very much. I had a very personal reaction to that, and it was very helpful. So.
Well, that's good. Of course, as I frequently say, I don't give these talks to like inform and educate. I throw stuff out there so we can chew on it, because we're all going to have a different connection to whatever the teachings are, right? I do think, we all know in our practice, we uncover these really subtle things. It's happened to me, it's happened to everybody, and when that happens, like, whoa, wait a minute, there's this whole thing that I've been completely ignoring. Or the other thing that's interesting is we can talk ourselves into, when I think about why do I believe what I believe, I can convince myself I believe this because it's for the good of other beings. And then I look at my assumptions around that and I just go, no. I think I'm, working on behalf of good, and then I look at the underlying assumption and go, oh, wait a minute, no, that's not how things really work, So we can have quite a deep personal response to that kind of thing. So it's a challenge. I think the more subtle, the things that we hold more deeply and the more subtle things are the more challenging things to look at. It's like the big gross stuff, we can look at that and kind of take it apart. It's not quite as painful as the things we realize are really subtle. Say, wait a minute, I'm participating in something that's unwholesome. So I didn't name or call out any particular kinds of work with those subtle things. However, the national dialogue at the moment is full of them. maybe that's what you're working on. I don't mean you, Iris, I mean the group. Maybe that's what you're working on. Maybe it's something about your own perceptions of your coworkers, or how you work with people, or how you work with your own stuff, or whatever. But yeah, it's when you see those things, it's kind of powerful, right? And practice can be a real key. It can really help us unlock that stuff. Like, what's my foolishness today? And I think it's important to think about what is the effect of that on Indra's net. It's not just my personal foolishness. I mean, it is mine, but it's like, and it might not just be, the people I live with, or the people I work closely with. I'm like pouring something into the world. Like, what's going on there? How am I feeding the three poisons in a big way, right? So again, it looks like a huge job, and we might say, well, I can't even begin. It's so big, and we can't beat ourselves up for that. We have to say, bodhisattva activity is I uncover one little piece of foolishness at a time and do what I can about that, right? What would others like to say?
I have something.
Okay.
So I was yesterday. I was presented with four separate opportunities to like be helpful and be of service to another person. and I'm not saying that to humble brag, like, at all. What I want to say about it is, when I participate in that flow that's presented to me, to help somebody out, or whatever it is, if somebody needs money or assistance, and I participate in that. My feeling as a person feels more wholesome and connected to what's around me, as paying attention to that interconnectedness and being a part of that interconnectedness. Versus, there probably, another time in my life, when I was just a lot more selfish person, I would have, somebody would ask me money, I'd probably be suspicious, and, I wonder if they're trying to take advantage of me, or somebody needed some help, I might have procrastinated and put it off, and just kind of shoved it off to the side. So it's just, I think that's been a real shift for me in my perception and my actions toward others, just through Zen practice.
Well, those kind of relationships are a huge ground for practice, aren't they?
Yeah.
Right? The practice doesn't just happen on the cushion. Then what happens when we get up and go out the door? I'm presented with somebody who needs my help. Well, on the one hand, we need to not have idiot compassion, right? Somebody who asks for something, maybe the skillful thing is not to give that person what he or she wants, and we need to do that discernment too, right? But at least if we have enough of a spirit of inquiry to investigate what's happening for ourselves, and don't just immediately say, no, 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 I'm going to protect myself, and, there's something interesting that happens there. There's some liberation that happens there. So if, when we're participating in that kind of giving and taking, giver, receiver, and gift, and we're not obstructing it, as you say, there's an interesting thing that happens there. There's a recognition of interconnection that happens there, and in that moment we're having some wisdom and compassion. We're not ignoring that connection. So yeah, practice can help us, I think, help us investigate those things in an interesting way. What would others like to say? Sagan, please.
Yeah, a couple of times in your talk, I heard you make the remark, we shouldn't beat ourselves up about that. And I think that's something that I have trouble with, in a sense. I mean, there's like a puzzle there. To what extent do I challenge myself, and in other words, do I go too far in being too hard on myself or too easy on myself? And sometimes I find that a real koan. I mean, it's not clear to me.
Yeah, well, and of course, what is that but a challenge to our self-concept? If we're beating ourselves up for something, it's because we have an idea about how we should be. So then we get to let go of that too, right? So we get to see, there's some area of unfoolishness, some area of foolishness. It's part of the human condition. So we get to have compassion for ourselves as karmic beings. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have foolishness. It is the nature of karmic self. And then the other thing we get to do at the same time is say, if I'm feeling embarrassed or ashamed or something by this foolishness, that's a challenge to my self-concept. I get to let go of that too, right? So, on the one hand, the compassion is good, and on the other hand, what we get to do is even let go of that, right? I think it's easy for us to want to hear, this is what good practice is, or this is what we should be aiming for, this is how we ought to be as practitioners or as bodhisattvas or something. And I think in the beginning we need some direction, absolutely. But then to hold ourselves, hold up a picture and say, here's the perfect me. Here's the perfect me as bodhisattva. Here's this area of confusion. I've fallen down. Oh, it's one thing to recognize there's something here that's out of alignment, or something that I get to consider or work on or investigate. And it's another thing to say, that makes me a bad person. And I don't think that's what you're doing, but I'm just saying, recognizing that our practice is incomplete is what vow and repentance is all about. So again, repentance is not about, oh, I'm a terrible person. Repentance means my practice isn't complete and it never will be. So the foolishness is going to go on and on and on to the break of dawn, because we are karmic beings. There will be foolishness. So if in our discernment we uncover some area of foolishness, great. That's something we get to work on. But to have an idea about that is still clinging, right? Then we get to open the hand of that as well. So there's so many little subtleties for this. If we're constantly holding up the yardstick and we find the foolishness and then there's this resistance, right? We're creating hindrances for ourselves, and yet we do it because we're human beings. So we get to see the foolishness, and then we get to see the clinging to self-concept, and then we get to see that that will never go away, and then we get to do it again, right? Over and over and over and over and over. So picking this stuff apart, there's just so much subtlety here. This is why we need the discernment, right, and the inquiry piece. Do you want to follow up on anything there, Sagan?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. It's a helpful thing to bring up. I mean, for everybody. It doesn't matter how long we've been practicing. We all have this dynamic. So it's a helpful thing to recognize. Other things people would like to say. Mark, please. Fraley. This is Mark.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about group stupidity. So, and this is something that, I think about a lot, because I think that in this day and age, especially in a COVID environment, and we're spending a lot of time behind screens, sometimes our attitudes about compassion or good deeds or what is a good action is something that's oftentimes more performed than done. Or oftentimes we find ourselves like having this concept of what it means to be on the right side of things or do the good things, and then find some way to post it or show it to the world. And then you kind of see a lot of that sort of, even when you have a lot of really, really good ideas and a lot of good-hearted, good intention things come out all at one time, a sort of group stupidity, I guess, the Kodo Sawaki's words, not mine, tends to emerge, or a sort of mass thinking starts to emerge. And then it's almost natural that the next moment there's a reaction to that, right? That people point out that as this mass hysteria. And then a sort of another group stupidity tends to emerge on that side, right? And it becomes very easy to get wound up in it, partly because you actually can sympathize with what a lot of the people are saying. And so Zazen, so Zen practice has been very helpful sometimes in those regards as a moment of stepping back, not so much as a means of stepping back because I want this bliss while all this chaos is occurring, because to me, there's very few places more chaotic than my own head. But it is kind of helpful in terms of coming back to these areas. But when you actually kind of see a lot of people individuals acting with a sort of mass mentality in mind, it can also be kind of a lonely thing to come back to. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Oh, that's all so interesting, isn't it? This is why this gate is just so huge. There's just so, yeah. So I think it's not unrelated to what we were saying earlier about authenticity, right? It's like, even if I see foolishness, how do I take authentic action? Because as you say, today we spend a lot of time in front of the computer. We may feel like that's the only ground of action that we have. So I can't go out and save the world today, but I can post a Facebook meme. And we might think, there, I've done my job, you know? Or it makes us feel like at least we've done something. And I mean, that's just the classic bodhisattva thing. You know, the suffering of the world is so huge. You know, where do I even begin? I'm going to do one thing because I can do one thing. And tomorrow I'll do, you know, one more thing. So it's certainly true that we can get caught up in group thinking, and then we swing back the other way. All of that is an opportunity for us to do our own discernment and to engage with our own authenticity. What do I believe and why do I believe it? And then, you know, that's here. And what am I saying about that? And what am I doing about that? And am I sort of just going along and riding the wave? Or am I actually taking skillful action that I have considered? And it's coming out of my own practice, and it's coming out of my own day-to-day, moment-by-moment, real experience, not the stories that I'm writing and what people are telling me and da-da-da. I have to like do my own discernment. I have to engage with things. So again, cutting myself off is not going to help. So it might not be harmful to post the Facebook meme, but is it enough? Have I changed my thinking? Have I investigated why I think that meme is important? Have I had a conversation with somebody? And, you know, out of that, has there been some actual action? Is there something that I'm going to do? I think it's really easy to just say something, and then say, well, on that basis, I am the person I want to be. I'm putting into the world, you know, wholesomeness. None of that might be bad, but is it enough? As a bodhisattva, you know, is it enough? So are we simply going along, or are we deeply investigating? Because it can be so easy to get caught up in somebody says something that sounds good. Have I thought it through? Even if it seems wholesome, have I thought it through? Do I understand that person's point of view? Do I understand my own point of view around that? You know, it's the same way that we read the Dharma, right? On our in our Wednesday night group, we're not reading something written from within our Dharma family, which is fine, but we're reading it through the lens of the Sanshin style. Why am I doing that? Because I want you to be able to read any kind of Dharma book you want and put it in context. I want you to do your own discernment, do your own inquiry, and say, oh, that's that thing we were talking about. Because it's, you know, used different language or something, but here it is again. So it's kind of like our life is kind of the same way. What do I believe? Why do I believe it? You know, what's my place in the universe? What's my practice? What are my vows about, whether they're formal or not? What's my direction? And then when I'm surrounded by all of this stuff, I have some way to do some discernment. Am I posting this because I really think it's true? Am I having this conversation in a way that advances understanding? Am I actively seeking to understand somebody else's point of view, or am I just talking to persuade, you know? So that's the kind of bodhisattva activity that can happen now. And we're in the midst of the maelstrom, folks. I mean, there's just like stuff going on. Not only, as you say, is most of the chaos here, or a big part of the chaos, you know, it's like in my own thinking, in my own just experience of this moment. But just everything going on around me. You know, I'm scared. There's COVID. There's unrest. There's, you know, am I going to have a job tomorrow? There's all of that in addition to my normal foolishness. Now I get to do discernment around that. So it's a huge time to practice, right? It's a really big time to practice. Mark, do you want to follow up on any of that?
No, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for stepping in and kind of throwing that out, because that's one of those things that I think is on everybody's mind. I'm not going to go there for you. You know, I rely on you all to bring up what's bubbling in your own practice. But, you know, all of the things we've talked about today are, I think, relevant for our sort of small self, individual exploration of our own experience, and also our experience in the larger world, right? I mean, I think things are happening in both places. What would other people like to say? Your own questions, your own experience, your own foolishness, or anything else this morning? Okay. Please just continue to investigate this gate. It's huge. It's like our whole life, right? There's so much to chew on there. In weeks to come, if you want to come back to any part of this gate, please raise it, because this is not a gate we go through once. It's going to continue to unfold for us, you know, forever and ever. So a really huge gate this morning, I think. I'm going to pitch back to Hoshin for our closing chant and some announcements. Thank you for a good discussion. So until next time, stay safe and well.